Cultural intelligence is essential for any marketer who wants to be effective with inclusive marketing. Cultural intelligence is the foundation for helping you to engage with consumers from underrepresented and underserved communities in an authentic way that makes people feel seen, supported, and like they belong with your brand. But a lot of marketers and brand teams really lack the cultural intelligence that they need to effectively engage people from underrepresented and underserved communities, which is a big problem, and it negatively impacts their marketing and how they're able to connect with people from these communities. I'm Sonia Thompson, an inclusive marketing strategist, coach, and consultant, and I help brands attract a bigger, more diverse, and fiercely loyal customer base. And because cultural intelligence is critically important and so many brands struggle with it, I thought I would sit down with someone who's actually written a book all about cultural intelligence for marketers. So let's get into this really juicy, really insightful conversation. Hey, Anastasia, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sonia. Thanks for having me here. Very excited for our conversation today.
Oh, I am too. We're going to have a really wonderful one. I say that all the time, but like each one is so rich and I'm always thrilled to have the conversation. Okay, before we get too far into it, tell the people, who are you and what do you do?
I am a cultural theorist turned brand strategist, although I still bring my cultural theory training, I guess, to the work that I do now. I am a senior insights lead at Reddit, and in my thought leadership, I engage with a lot of questions of inclusive marketing, of conscious marketing. How do we really understand the role of brands in culture? And so recently I wrote a book, Cultural Intelligence for Marketers, which kind of builds on that work. So that's what I do, and trying to bring more of cultural insights into the world of marketing.
For sure. All right. Well, we're going to talk all about cultural intelligence today and how to integrate those things. But to make sure that we get everybody on the same page, can you just tell us what is cultural intelligence?
I love that question because, due to my academic background, I just believe that definitions are very important. And as I write in the book, we can go online and look at different pieces of thought leadership, and all of them kind of define cultural intelligence in different ways. So originally, the concept comes from cross cultural management studies, and some marketers have picked it up and applied it in a similar way to suggest that cultural intelligence really refers to our ability to speak to people from different cultures. I come more so from the background of trends research and market research, and really helping understand the role that brands have as culture is evolving. So I kind of build up on that original definition to define cultural intelligence as a practice of tracking, analyzing, understanding where culture is headed. So cultural movements, social causes, trends within the cultural marketplace, and using that cultural knowledge to help brands and businesses create commercial advantage, and at the same time impact culture and society in a positive manner.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so in your book, you put that culture and cultural intelligence are can be sources of competitive advantage for a brand. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I imagine not a lot of people realize why or that this could even be the case.
I feel very passionate about this question because in the marketing discourse, I find more and more there's kind of collapsing of anything that has to do with cultural and social issues into the idea of social purpose. So brands doing well in the world and doing good for the benefit of people. But what seems to be missing sometimes from where I sit is the understanding that regardless of the fact that some brands have social purpose attached to their business positioning, all brands are engaged in culture, are looking to harness trends and stay relevant. That question of relevancy is key to any business that wants to continue to thrive and keep up. And so for that reason, cultural intelligence is really speaking to that broader need for businesses to understand their consumers and understand how their expectations, how their values, how their needs are evolving along as culture is evolves too. And cultural intelligence really offers brand-driven business as an opportunity to look at culture, to understand their role not only within the category, but within culture and society more broadly, and use that knowledge to position their business in a way that really speaks to what consumers are looking for at one point or another.
So a lot of times we will see brands engaging in the culture from a standpoint of language and slang, and that's often how they started like kind of dip their toe in because they want to feel like they're cool and relevant with what's going on in the way in which people are talking. But sometimes people are able to relate to it and other times people aren't, and they're like, I wish brands wouldn't do that. And I'm interested from your perspective to see what your thoughts are on where brands commonly struggle when trying to embrace the culture and apply their understanding of cultural intelligence in their marketing.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it seems that that's precisely the area where most mistakes happen as brands are trying to be relevant and engage cultural communities. But let's be real, marketing is still a very white industry that's dominated by people in decision making roles that are not necessarily connected to the communities that we often speak to. And so this language, the example of language is something I specifically feel passionate about, and why I think cultural intelligence is so important, because we see brands wanting to speak to Gen Z audiences, right? Young people. And a lot of times they do so in a ways that's not are only not particularly compelling on or authentic, but are actually appropriative of African American vernacular, of Black vernacular cultures where that comes from. And what happens when brands go to market? Papa John's, I believe, is a recent example of that, of using Black vernacular, for instance, to speak to young people without really understanding, well, where that vernacular comes from, what kind of communities have been the producers of those linguistic traditions or cultural artifacts that brands are borrowing from. And so for that reason, it seems very important to treat cultural intelligence not only as, doing well for culture or doing well for society and contributing, but really taking the time to understand where are we getting the elements of marketing that we are harnessing for the benefit of the business. And that kind of raises a question of, well, what ethical considerations are marketers obligated to consider when trying to resonate with consumers while borrowing from culture communities that are not really respected in the process?
So I want to get into the details a little bit because you've outlined a bit of a framework for cultural intelligence that you're calling the 4 C's. Can you walk us through what those 4 C's are so we can start to give a foundation of like what does this even involve?
Absolutely. The 4 C's framework is really meant, or I try to design it in a way that would help marketers navigate some of the challenges and nuances that I just was talking about. So 4 C's framework really goes through 4 pillars, which are culture, communication, critical consciousness, and community. And the way that I imagine it and conceptualize it is this: culture is really the central pillar where all starts. And in the book, I talk quite a bit about the importance of brands understanding the role that they play in culture and in their category at the same time. So it's really about thinking of brands not only just as businesses or entities just floating, in the marketplace, but brands as cultural agents that are drawing on communities, on cultural artifacts, on traditions or linguistic traditions, as we just talked about, and are signaling something to the world. And so that brings us into communication, which is really helping marketers understand how messaging travels into the marketplace. We can think of multiple examples where brands failed miserably with inclusive marketing strategies. And you might agree that for some of us, we would have seen that coming miles away, right? A lot of these mistakes happen because the right people are not in the room to provide input and to consult and to supervise that, but also because brands are not anticipating the potential interpretations that some segments of their audiences might have. So communication really says, how do we anticipate some of those interpretations that could arise when we put something into the marketplace. And then critical consciousness really focuses on how do we infuse values of equity, social responsibility, diversity into the core of marketing practice, not as an afterthought or an add-on. And community speaks to customer engagement and engaging with communities in a way that feels more reciprocal and less extractive and appropriative, which, as we know, has been how brands have operated in decades past, with no real accountability for the culture that's being borrowed from communities and then profited from.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I wanted to dive into a little bit more because I see this a lot. More brands are starting to engage in inclusive marketing, which I'm thrilled about, but they're doing it in a manner that just feels like they're extracting from these communities because we're like, okay, we're going to start marketing to you so you'll buy more of our stuff without actually uplifting the community, investing in the community, collaborating with them. So I'm wondering, and as a result, basically, a lot of people from underrepresented and underserved communities are really skeptical of brands that suddenly decide to start engaging in inclusive marketing. So, what are your thoughts on how brands should prioritize the community aspect of your 4 C's of cultural intelligence to make sure that they are doing this in a right way? And a second part to this question is, does this come from the brand, like the actual marketing team? Or is this something that feels like it's coming from like corporate communications or charitable contributions, if it's something from there? So I know it's a big question, but
Mhm. I guess I will pick up on your second question first, which I'm a believer that marketing plays an important function because that's how brand goes to marketplace. That's how brand puts out its messaging, its ideas into culture. But I don't think it should be necessarily restricted just to the marketing function. And I have heard that quite a few people outside of the marketing profession as such have picked up the book and found it useful, which was my intention to really present these ideas to various functions within marketing and beyond. And part of what we talk about inclusive marketing is so valuable and so should be welcome, as you said, but also cannot be divorced from the business's broader social responsibility, the practices, labor practices, supply chain practices, and so on. And I think that part of the conversation we haven't even unpacked yet, and we should. Because that's how performativity and kind of superficial gestures of inclusivity arise, is when businesses present marketing messages that are inclusive but are not quite inclusive and equitable in running the business. So I do wholeheartedly believe that both should coexist. And to your first question about the community, it seems very important to me for us as marketing professionals to actually be honest that part of what it means to go to market as a business is to be opportunistic to some extent. I was just writing about this last night for a piece I'm publishing, where I was talking about how, in order to speak to communities in a more authentic, real way, actually, as marketers, we should be very honest about what our function is, like without romanticizing brands as some saviors, as entities that can go and create inclusivity, right? There's some sense of humility that I think this work requires. And it starts with saying, historically, businesses have appropriated and frankly exploited a lot of cultural communities. So, what does it mean to give back? And I am a firm believer in integrating material impact and financial contribution into any kind of purpose driven marketing campaign, inclusive campaign that not only speaks to, or most often at, communities, but actually treats communities as partners. And that can look in a variety of ways, as contributing financially to existing cultural organizations that are already doing the work, as well as bringing members of that community as paid consultants and part members of the process, and compensating people directly related to these communities in very tangible material ways.
I love that because I think that this really goes to the whole concept of what it means to build an inclusive brand. It's not just about the marketing and the campaigns that you produce. The entire brand needs to be thinking about inclusion and thinking about how do we serve these communities and be involved in that format, and be involved in that. And so if we're thinking about, as you're saying, like supplier diversity, corporate contributions, other types of programs that are happening at the brand level, in addition to the marketing, in addition to the hiring, et cetera, it really speaks to letting consumers know that, yes, this brand really is about what they say they are. And it's not just, here so they can sell more stuff to, specific communities. They understand that it means investing in the community as well, and that happens in a multitude of ways. All right, so what are your thoughts on how brands should go about embedding cultural intelligence into their marketing team? So it's not just something that they read a research study about, that they actually go out and they know what's happening and they understand what's happening in the communities.
Well, I'm a big believer that we need a total paradigm shift on how we approach inclusive marketing, or how I have started more often calling it conscious marketing. And I can unpack why I'm starting to use the language of consciousness. And it's precisely because so much of this work is still treated as a kind of afterthought, and as a area of work that might be more relevant to explicitly purpose driven brands, and rather than all brand driven businesses that are going to market. And I find it so important to talk about this idea of nurturing and understanding of our own biases as marketers, and our own assumptions that get ingrained into the work that we do now. So from my point of view, this work doesn't necessarily have to start for a brand with a purpose-driven campaign right away, or an inclusive marketing campaign. It really starts with embedding certain values within our teams and organizations, where that sort of thinking is valued, normalized, encouraged, and supported by the leadership. And what does that mean? I find that cultural intelligence can be thought of as almost a professional skill that we need to develop, a matter of cultural literacy as a skill set that modern day marketers need to acquire and develop over time. And it really starts with leaders normalizing that conversation and centering that conversation, and pushing back against some of the broader cultural conversations that we're having right now, that are really not only pushing back but actively attacking equity and inclusion work. And so within brands, I think we need to actively resist that by reframing the conversation to say, well, to be a modern day marketer in this day and age, serving the communities of people that we serve as businesses, that has to be part of the skill set. And so in the cultural intelligence for marketers, the way that I conceptualize that work is not a specific campaign, but rather a set of skills that marketers need to acquire, which starts with questioning our own assumptions. Because I often find that we look back at incredibly egregiously racist and sexist advertising that has been put out throughout history, and we kind of try to distance ourselves from it to say, well, that was offensive. But we don't really think about how ourselves as marketers, we are also producing media, and we must have biases and prejudices that are baked in. So for me, it all starts with nurturing a culture of questioning within organizations.
For sure. This is a related question that is about marketing teams as well, because I'm starting to see more and more that brands are having people whose job is like inclusive marketing, multicultural marketing, Hispanic marketing, right? Like they're specific to communities or specific to this. And I'm wondering what are your thoughts on making sure that as brands are thinking about cultural intelligence, they're not making it the job of one person who has this title, or that they're think like as a brand starts getting more well versed in cultural intelligence, what is the role of integrating that with people who actually have lived experiences that are part of that culture? Because there's a lot of nuances and building blocks, I imagine, that ensure that the right voices are being heard while everybody is developing this skill.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. And that's why I try to draw a pretty clear line in my own work between expertise and lived experience and being part of
Okay.
communities. I have 2 degrees in Black studies. I did my bachelor's in African American studies and my PhD in race and gender studies with a focus on Black feminist studies. So oftentimes I can speak broadly to these issues, but I should not be involved in a campaign that is speaking to Black communities. For example, I'm not from that community. And I think there is a kind of confusion around or lack of clarity, I should say, within marketing circles between our collective responsibility as marketers to check our biases, to ensure that our work is inclusive, to ensure that we are checking our work, that we are being conscientious and self aware enough of how our own lived experiences are actively affecting the work that we produce,
Mhm.
versus who gets to be behind the camera, who gets to write the script, who gets to be the creative. I mean, I feel like some of the most egregious marketing fails that we see, which are seem inclusive, but are just don't feel authentic enough, are because the rooms are full, I mean, frankly, of white people who have no connection to the communities that we speak to. And we see, multicultural agencies that are, some of them are now Black led and specifically led by leaders from those communities. But that has not always been the case. And I think there's still a segment of marketing where um, that is not normalized. So I draw that line between our collective responsibility to check our biases, our assumptions, and our responsibility to actually create hiring opportunities for people from those communities to bring them in. And so for me, that kind of balances out of where we should take responsibility ourselves and when it is the right thing to do to step back and ensure that correct people are at the decision making table as part of the creative process and so on. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, like going back to what you said earlier, it's a big paradigm shift, right? In terms of how we think about this, how we go to market, how we build and shape our teams, so that we can engage with these communities effectively. All right, so one other question before we switch gears a little bit. Let's say a brand's like, okay, we understand cultural intelligence is critically important. It is a source of competitive advantage. It is what we need to do to connect authentically with the communities that we want to serve. Where do we get started? What's your advice?
Mm, I mean, realistically speaking or idealistically speaking, I guess the answers differ from what I hope will happen, which is that brands and businesses more broadly kind of create space institutionally in terms of resourcing to do this work, because we can talk all day about what brands should do, but if the leadership is not invested and is not providing resources and the platform to do this work within the organizations, again, as you said, it falls on to the shoulders of select people who then are less focused on doing the work and finding the bureaucracies and spending their time convincing the leadership that this work is valuable. And so I truly believe that the future of marketing is the creation of cultural intelligence teams in house where brands can actually invest in cultural literacy as an organizational value. And again, do I see that happening in the nearest future? Not necessarily. I think we still have a long way to go. But at the very least, I think brands should begin by bringing in consultants, members of the community, and audiences to which they speak, and engage them in the process at the very least. I speak in the book a lot about co creation. I think the era of marketing where brands just speak at consumers and the rooms where campaigns are made are not really representative of people that brands serve is coming to an end. And consumers are more skeptical, scrutinizing brands. There's just no way that brands can succeed without tapping into that co creation. And in the book, I spent quite a few pages talking about partnerships with cultural communities, what it means to bring in not only consultant as a one-off, check the box kind of project, but actually engaging people in the work. And it might sound like an extra investment when we know marketing leaders are struggling with budgets and financial priorities, but I just don't see how any brand can be successful, not only in the near future, but in the long-term future of 10, 20, 30 years without investing institutionally in that kind of function within their organizations.
Yeah. So as you were explaining that, one thing that kind of brought up a thought is, would you think it would be good for a brand, because most every brand of a large size, medium size, has a market research department or an insights department or team. Does cultural intelligence fit into that, or should it be its own sort of area specifically where we're constantly staying in touch with culture, including co-creation, things like that, and then sort of dispersing that on the team? Is that kind of how you're explaining it, or is that my
I
imagination?
I do think that it can be well suited for insights teams.
Okay.
I guess it just depends on how that team is structured. I sit on the insights team myself, and that is precisely what we do, understanding
Nice.
where culture is headed, what community conversation is telling us about. What consumers value, what they expect, how to speak to them in a way that's really relevant and emotionally resonant. And the reason I find it important for there to be a firm intersection between insights function and cultural intelligence, because as I said earlier, conscious marketing cannot be an afterthought, and it has to start from the beginning. And where do we start? With research, with understanding the consumers. And so I am less inclined to think of consumer and market research as completely separate from cultural intelligence. If anything, I think the practice of cultural intelligence needs to be more firmly embedded within the market and consumer research function, so that the insights we produce about the consumers that we speak to have that quality of, or the principle of equity and inclusivity baked into the work that we do, and the work that informs the broader strategy down the road. I talk quite a bit in the book about this idea of universal human insight, and how historically what we call universal insight is really a perspective of white dominant audiences. So for that reason, I find the integration of cultural intelligence into that research process to be extremely important. Though, of course, in ideal world, I would love to see a separate function dedicated to the study of culture within our brands. But of course, we have to operate within the realistic parameters of the work
Yeah.
that we do in organizations.
Very cool. All right, so let's switch gears slightly. I'm curious, from your perspective as a consumer, can you tell me about a time where a brand made you feel like you belonged?
What a good question. I think of the most recent example that perhaps isn't some award winning campaign, that we would often talk about in examples of, well executed inclusive marketing. But from a very real human perspective, I was in New York City the other week for the launch of my book, and I was using Lyft to move around the city. And I opened the app, and I have read before about their Women Plus initiative that basically offered me as a customer, as a rider, to opt in to being matched with a female or non-binary driver whenever that is possible. Now, there are certain flaws to that structurally, because by the virtue of our society, there are just much fewer female or non-binary drivers in such a male-dominated profession. But in that moment, as somebody who has had to worry about my safety, and that's like really part of my lived experience, as once a girl, now a woman, I really felt connected to the brand, that there was that consideration in place for what it means for me as a woman to move through the world in regards to my safety. And although in those days I did not get matched with a female driver, again, structurally, there are just much fewer drivers of the same gender as me, I did feel a connection to the brand and feel very seen for my experience. So it's an imperfect example within a system that is imperfect by design and functions in a particular way. But it is an instance where I was like, oh, I feel really seen in my customer journey. So
Yeah.
that's the one that comes to mind.
I love that because, and even your description of it, because I think that sometimes when it comes to inclusive marketing, people feel like it's got to be perfect from the beginning. Like we can't do it unless it's perfect. And that's not really the essence of it. I think sometimes seeing people as an example of Lyft, it just makes it goes a long way. And then through the process of co-creation, identifying, ways in which we can make that better, you can improve something over time. But it all starts with seeing people and understanding and recognizing, acknowledging that different people have different experiences. So how can we as a brand make sure that we work with those, right? So love that example. Where can people find you if they want to know more about you and your work? I'm going to drop a link to your book in the show notes, but in case they want to follow along, you've got a very lively LinkedIn account.
I do. I was about to mention that. Well, I feel very passionate about curating those critical conversations because I speak to a lot of marketers who really want to do well, but don't know where to start or feel alone in their journey. So I am quite active on LinkedIn, where folks can connect with me. I am also on Instagram, although I should warn my content is a little bit more inclined towards activism, but I always talk about the need to expand our point of reference as marketers. So if you're interested in perspectives of grassroots activist communities where, I've had 15 years of experience being in the social justice movements, my Instagram is a little bit of a different window into my life outside of marketing.
Well, I will put links to all that in the show notes. I love following along with you. I love your boldness and how you talk about things, and you're fearless. And I love the fearlessness that you have in your content and just talking about issues. So definitely, I recommend that people follow you.
Thank you, Sonia. I am so humbled and have been following your journey for quite a while now. And so just happy that we got to finally meet face to face and chat, and hope
Absolutely.
this is just one of many conversations to come.
Absolutely, it will be. Any parting words of wisdom for marketers and business leaders who want to do a better job of incorporating cultural intelligence into their inclusive marketing strategy, into their marketing strategy, period? Let's just say that.
Let me just double down on the point that I just make about expanding our point of reference. I find that oftentimes working on brands, we kind of can be detached from the outside world and consumed by the brands that we manage or branding clients that we serve. And I find that my superpower is really my connection to ordinary communities, as somebody who probably was boycotting and criticizing the brands 10 years ago. And so I would just invite marketing colleagues to engage in culture, beyond the realms of business, and see what people are talking about outside of the bubbles of LA and New York City, Chicago, where life is really lived. That's what my favorite cultural theorist, Stuart Hall, really teaches us. Culture doesn't happen in trend reports. It really happens in ordinary lives that are lived and experienced. So expand your point of reference and be open to uncomfortable conversations, because that's really how we innovate and advance forward.
Very cool. Thanks so much, Anastasia, for stopping by. This
Thank you
has
so
been
much.
a true treat and a joy.
Likewise. Thank you.
I am curious to hear what was most insightful for you as a result of this conversation. One of the things that Dr. Gabriel said that I personally loved was all about how to embed cultural intelligence into the day-to-day of how brands operate. So let me know in the comments below what stood out most for you, and let's continue the conversation. I'm also super curious to know if you're able to tell the difference whenever brands have a lot of cultural intelligence and whenever not so much. Let me know about it in the comments below. And if you're interested in another related topic, I've got this video right here for you, which is all about using pop culture references and how to do it the right way. You're gonna need a lot of cultural intelligence to do so for your brand as well. So go ahead and check that video out. Until next time, remember, everyone deserves to have a place where they belong. Let's use our individual and collective power to ensure more people feel like they do. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you soon.